In the last lecture, we talked about new criticism, and in this lecture, we would talk about a movement similar to new criticism known as formalism. It originated in Moscow, while new critics were from America, United States of America primarily. Formalists were from Russia, and at that time it was the USSR, and then it later moved to Prague after originating from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And they were again not interested in meaning at all, which is a significant characteristic of formalism. They consider form as everything, and they viewed literature as a specialized use of language. So, literature is nothing but a specialized use of language, according to the formalists. Unlike the new critics, the formalists would not talk about meaning at all. Instead, they would emphasize upon the difference between ordinary language and the literary language. So the emphasis would be upon the difference between ordinary language, the language of regular speech, and the literary language. And this is how they would come to the idea of literariness. So in this way, the formalists were trying to talk about a very different idea of literature, and in so doing they developed what is known as literariness, which is attributed to Roman Jakobson. And they also developed concepts like foregrounding, especially associated with Mukarovsky, and defamiliarization, which is associated with Victor Straubsky. Now, formalists were interested in this special aspect of verbal communication that generates meaning, but they never focused on meanings per se. And if we make it simpler, it would be like emphasizing how meaning is generated and undermining what is the meaning. So they would focus on how the meaning is generated rather than what the meaning is. And like the new critics, they would also ignore questions like who generates the meaning, that is, who is the author, what is the intention of the author. They are not going to ask such questions, because the aim is not to arrive at any kind of meaning, any kind of unity, and this is how they are different from the new critics, but to foreground the form. So that is what foregrounding is all about. It's about foregrounding the form. And literature for them is a different way of communication. It's different from the ordinary communication, because the language used in literature draws attention to itself. It foregrounds itself in this way. It is driven by what is known as literariness. So literature draws the attention of the critic to itself, to its language, not to any kind of thing which is external to the language, be it meaning, be it history, be it politics, right? So nothing is outside the literary text. And the language used in ordinary speech refers to the world which is extrinsic to itself. It is driven by meaning. A literary work instead foregrounds its own formal features instead of going to something which is extrinsic to itself, that is meaning, that can be something which is historical. A literary work foregrounds itself, and in so doing it disrupts the ordinary or familiar way of looking at things and renews our perception of life. That is what defamiliarization is all about. It defamiliarizes everyday things. It defamiliarizes the quotidian aspects of life. Now let us look at this poem, a very very famous poem by Robert Frost, Stopping by the Woods, where the speaker says, "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." It's a wonderful poem which is very, very rhythmic in nature. But then let's try to understand the formalist way of reading this poem and the new critical way of reading this poem. So, according to the new critics, there would be three aspects in this poem. First would be the conflict which comes in this particular part of the poem. These two stanzas: "My little horse must think it queer. He gives his harness bells a shake." So this is in conflict. The very idea of the horse is in conflict with the idea of the speaker. And before that we have exposition of this problem: "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though." So this is how the woods, the atmosphere, the entire poem gets introduced to us. And then finally there is a resolution: "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep." So this is how the resolution comes, that I cannot stop here. So exposition, conflict, resolution, forming a unity, and this would be loved by the new critics. And woods would stand for wildness, while horse, domestic animal, representing tamed spirit. Then we have thinking, cognition in the first stanza, again thinking, cognition in the second stanza, and then there is doing in the third stanza. And then to do, what is to be done, again something which is related to doing. So thinking and doing, there is a fine balance. In the first two stanzas the poet is emphasizing upon cognition. In the third and the last stanza, that is third and fourth stanzas, the speaker is trying to emphasize the doing, things to be done. So thinking and doing, this is how the unity is achieved. Now let's put it side by side. New critical reading would focus on exposition, conflict and resolution, creating unity and coherence. They would also focus on the contrast between wildness and tameness, which is again balancing each other out, forming a unity, coherence. And then there is a nature culture binary, the woods representing nature and the horse representing culture over here, while again the woods and horse, this is how the nature culture binary gets played out, forming a unity. Again there is a contrast between enjoyment and duty. The poet has a sense of duty towards the end, and there is also an enjoyment which is represented by the wood, the fascinating sight of the wood. There is a pleasure pain dichotomy at work as well. So the speaker is in two minds whether to go, whether to stay and enjoy the beauty of the wood, take the pleasure of the sight, or the pain of the duty. So again there is this fine tension. So instead of intention we have this tension in this poem, while formalists would focus on the words like know, though, here, snow, then quay, near, lake, ear. This is how the pattern goes. And then shake, mistake, sweep, flake, and then deep, keep, sleep, sleep. So the H sound wreckers, the W sound wreckers, these would be loved by the formalists. And then whose woods these are, I think I know. This is how the H and W sound wreckers. And this is how formalists would argue about defamiliarization, while the new critics would say that there's a unity which is resolved at the end. There's a conflict which is resolved at the end, forming unity. So the new critics would focus on unity, while the formalists would say this is how the everyday speech gets defamiliarized, creating a literariness. So we'll continue our discussion in the next classes. There are plenty of things to come. As you can see, we will now move on to structuralism, where we would come to know that how a text can be dehumanized, and then we would move on to post-structuralism and deconstruction. So thank you for watching this video. Hope you would watch the subsequent videos too. Thanks a lot.